Hello, and welcome to First Person Podcast, a monthly podcast put on by the editors of First Person Scholar. I'm Emma Bosson, editor-in-chief of First Person Scholar, and this month we're going to be talking about Game of the Year. We have 5 editors with us today, including Rob Parker, Alexandra Orlando, Chris Lawrence, Betsy Bray, and myself. This month we're talking about the meaning of Game of the Year, or the lack thereof, the history of Game of the Year, the games that were put forward for the title this year, and of course our own personal favorites from 2015.
Hi, my name is Rob. Go by the Twitter handle @robotparking on Twitter.
Hello, I'm Alex. I go by @Invagination on Twitter.
Hi, I'm Chris Lawrence. My Twitter handle is @CLawofPluto.
My name is Betsy. I'm @Betsy Bray.
And I'm Emma, and my Twitter handle is @GetSomeAction. So in typical first-person scholar fashion, we're going to start this podcast off with a more meta-critical discussion of the concept of Game of the Year, of the function of Game of the Year, and of the history of Game of the Year. And I bring this up because while preparing for this podcast, I did sort of some research, I don't know if you can call it that, basically trying to establish if I could apply a narrative to the growth of Game of the Year as a phenomenon, and I could not. And I think it's very postmodern, the way that it functions, that we have a plethora of games of the year, and that there isn't necessarily a lot of agreement about it. But there is kind of the overwhelming larger awards, like the Spike Video Game Awards. You've got the 2015 Game Awards, which I found out today, I guess it's like an offshoot of the Spike Game Awards.
Yeah, I think the Spike Game Awards one, they stopped.
They stopped it.
And then this is like Jeff Keighley's thing that he's doing on the side.
And it's sponsored by GameSpot, is that right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, this is the thing, is like I did all this research and finding little details like this is like really difficult. And like you can go to Wikipedia and they've got a list of Game of the Year awards, but they're so numerous, and
they have like a chart really of every body that has their Game of the Year, and some do it some years and some don't. Mm-hmm. So there's even gaps between like 2012 and 2013 even where they did them previously, they stopped for 2 years and then they did them again, and it's like, why?
It's fascinating how meaningless it is, you know? But yet we put so much effort and so much thought and so much meaning into it. So I guess my first question is sort of, can we cobble together a history of what Game of the Year is? Like, when do we remember first hearing about it? When was the first time you saw a Game of the Year edition game? That sort of thing.
When you're younger, you have more time than you have money.
Yeah.
So when I would get a game or when I would upgrade my computer, it was a very big event. So for me, it was looking at Bethesda's Elder Scrolls games, and when they started adding expansion packs and stuff like that. At a certain point, I would just wait until they released the Game of the Year edition of Elder Scrolls. I think it was when they released Morrowind and then they released Blood Moon, there was a version that came out sometime down the line that had both of them included and was cheaper than what I
That's how you get the most bang for your buck, essentially. Yeah.
So at a certain point, when Bethesda had released Oblivion or whatever, I was just going to wait. Yeah. I did that again this year with Fallout 4. I'm just going to wait until they release a Game of the Year edition of that.
Well, I remember when I was a lot younger, and I'm sure I can't be the only one who had this, where, like, I think in my head I thought there was some sort of singular Game of the Year, and then you'd walk into EB Games and there'd just be like, Game of the Year edition, 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 and you're like, what the hell?
I remember even before they had Game of the Year editions, for the PlayStation 1, they had the greatest hits.
Yep.
They had the green.
Yeah.
And who knows who was the authority on that? I mean,
because
probably they were all like
sales?
the major, maybe sales.
Yeah.
But it didn't have any new content or anything. It was just Game of the Year and worth less, because then the non-Game of the Year edition was like the original version, and suddenly was a little bit more lucrative because it wiped out the original versions.
Yeah.
But for me as a kid, it was like I only got 1 or 2 games a year. So those are my Game of the Year. Whatever one I picked off the shelf, whatever one I saw a commercial for, whenever one had the cool box art, that was my Game of the Year. I don't know if it's like the video games industry attempt to like mimic the film industry. Yeah. I think of at least the Oscars having some sort of function, despite the fact that who knows who's paying who off. It gives movies that you wouldn't go see in the theater normally a chance to be recognized, because your summer blockbusters aren't necessarily the best quality movies by kind of a movie snob standard. So at least then you're like, oh, there's these dramas that are worth seeing that you wouldn't just go into a movie theater and buy a ticket for when they have Avengers playing on the other screen. But with the Game Awards, you don't have that.
No.
It would be at least nice to have that. You kind of have the opposite, where it's just like, these are the games that people know already and played already, it doesn't know what it is yet.
Yeah, because I think that's the thing, is in theory, it's like the idea of it being like the Oscars for video games, but it does not function in the same way at all.
It doesn't have the same sort of authoritative background that you have with the Oscars, because you have an acting guild behind the Oscars, but anybody can have a Game of the Year, and everybody does.
Yeah, like I saw a thing today, something that said The Witcher 3 had gotten like 78 or 770 or whatever Game of the Year awards. Individually, they can't all be from or maybe they all are from reputable publications or whatever. Like if we just say right now, like, our Game of the Year is The Witcher 3, like, do we get to go on that tally? Like,
also, that's not our Game of the Year.
That is not our Game of the Year.
It would make their numbers go up, so they would welcome it.
But like, is that it? That's all I have to do?
I think
There's no way of measuring how they calculate it.
I think it's telling as far as the Game Awards show goes that the only thing I remember about it, like 2 months after it happened, is that Hideo Kojima was barred from attending it. I think Phantom Pain might have won Game of the Year there, but that's no. See, I don't know. That's the only thing I remember, is that little video that went viral where Jeff Keighley was announcing to a steadily boiling crowd that Kojima was barred. Regardless of what shows, media productions are now coalescing around this Game of the Year idea, I'm still kind of locked in that consumer's perspective that Rob was gesturing to, that for me, Game of the Year kind of just means the game I wait a year so I can get all the deals.
More likely it's the game of last year.
And there is still the thinnest veneer of credibility behind that, because if you dig deep enough for most of those releases, you are going to find a publication somewhere that gave that game Game of the Year, with the one notable exception of Two Worlds, which came out with the Velvet Game of the Year edition, and nobody could find the publication that gave them this award. So the only conclusion that anyone's been able to come up with is that they invented this award and gave it to themselves in order to re-release their own game.
So we're talking here, like, not only just about that game awards show that Jeff Keighley runs, but also the game criticism sites, their Game of the Year awards, as well as reissues of games that are like branded as such from publishers saying this is the Game of the Year. So I listened through a lot of the Giant Bomb Game of the Year deliberations. They post all of their deliberations in really long-ass podcasts, like 4-hour podcasts over the holidays.
It's like jury deliberations?
Yeah,
like...
it is straight up them in a room talking into a microphone for hours about best music. And so you start seeing like how subjective that process is.
Yeah.
And you see, weird little alliances erupt. People have very specific games that they're championing. If you study rhetoric, you should really take a look at some of those. But one really interesting part is Austin Walker, friend of the site, is on their editorial staff now, and one thing that he was trying to challenge in those deliberations was the idea that they were mentioning games that they felt obligated to mention. The Witcher 3 was actually that game. A lot of them had played a bunch of it, but no one had finished it, and no one particularly really liked it at a certain point. They stopped playing it, but they felt obligated to keep talking about it because it had the most game. And
also the most Game of the Year awards.
Right. 700.
I made that up. I have no idea how many Game of the Year awards.
703.
But I think, from what I can gather, it has won the most Game of the Year awards. I think that's correct, yeah.
I'm not surprised.
Whatever number it is.
700.
We've kind of talked about this already, but I'll just ask it straight out. What is the purpose of the Game of the Year award?
Box art?
Box art.
Put out
Graphic
a new
design.
box art with your little award.
It's a fake award.
Because there's a value there. There's an exchange there, right? Like, it's good for GameSpot to have their logo on a good,
of course,
on a good game, or on a game anywhere in a shelf.
But it's like an elaborate exchange of cultural capital.
Video games get awards all the time, even when they're not finished. If you think of the best of E3 awards, which are the most useless awards, in my opinion, when would you ever, in any other circumstance, give an award to something that is not finished? Yeah. It's like the restaurant is half built, and you may have one chef that's starting to put together a menu, but it has the best of not built restaurant yet award.
That's just unfinished dissertation chapter.
Yeah, really, right? I'm making a sandwich when it'll be done and it'll be amazing, but right now it's getting an award, so it motivates me.
It's fascinating to see
pre-order, maybe.
Like the rules that go around those judges too. Of like, this game, to get this award, it has to be playable in some form. So like, it's at a certain point, it's also delineating what a game is for like a very provisional point, so that they can give an award to it.
Yeah. You
Even
look
though
at
that changes once the game is released.
You look at that Deus Ex, the new one, Mankind Divided. In the trailer, the first thing, over 70 awards, and it's just like, what?
What
Which
awards?
Ones? From who? Not what?
Like, what does it mean? Like, what?
Who? Why? I don't know.
So there are the Games for Change Awards put on by the Games for Change Conference, I think, which I can't believe none of us have ever been to now that I'm saying it out loud. And so they give out their own awards every year of like what they think are the best social impact games. So that's kind of a separate thing, right? They've got their own thing. Their games this year, for example, were Never Alone, This War of Mine, and That's Your Right, that constitutional card game. But then separate from that, game awards, the ones we've been talking about this whole time, they have their own category that they have like best narrative, best blah, 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 blah. But they have a Games for Change category. And I found this really interesting and I got all fascinated by this because, for example, their games this year that were nominated in Games for Change were Sybil, Her Story, Life is Strange, Sunset, and Undertale. And so it's just interesting because their actual nominees for Game of the Year were, I think, The Witcher 3, Metal Gear Solid, Fallout 4, and Mario Maker.
And Bloodborne.
Sorry. I missed that obvious one. Anyway, so I find it really interesting because there's this extra category to fit in these games that wouldn't normally be considered for video game awards, maybe. But at the same time, it's like, why aren't any of these being considered for Game of the Year, right? It's almost like its own Game of the Year at the Game Awards, but for that other kind of game.
The Not Game Awards.
Here's the ghetto where we put the SJW games, essentially, if I'm going to be really brutal about it.
Was Her Story in that category, though?
Her Story was nominated in the Games for Change category, but it was also in the Best Narrative category.
So is it the Game Awards 2015, is that the Games for Impact?
No.
Games for Impact.
Games for Change. Oh, is there also a Games for Impact category?
So there's the Games for Change group. That is a separate body, I think, right?
Yeah, but then there's another thing.
So the Game Awards, the Jeff Keighley thing, has Games for Impact, and that's where they put Sybil, Her Story, Life is Strange, Sunset, Undertale.
I was looking at a different website.
Okay,
same award,
the Game Awards.
But I was looking at the list on GameSpot. So I think what happened is if you look it up on GameSpot, they called it Games for Change.
I like the fact that we're even having this conversation.
Yeah, I know. So ridiculous.
It's proving our point already. I think it's weird because on the one hand, there's a vested interest in like games culture to kind of put that stuff to the outside as a ghetto. On the other hand, there's a vested interest like people are trying to acknowledge these games and they're trying to course correct that way.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately those games also benefit from being like also outside of games culture in a lot of ways, like not necessarily being tied to that as like a metric for success.
Well, because that's the thing is when people were actually putting, like the year Gone Home came out, when people were actually saying, like, nominating Gone Home alongside Grand Theft Auto 5, that also came out that year, like, that was really causing a ruckus. So it's almost like if we have our own, I said we, that's terrible, rhetorically. If there's this category for Games for Impact or Games for Change, it's like you're not causing a ruckus by having to take up that spot on the Bloodborne Fallout list.
It's the social justice sidebar that Polygon does and then doesn't necessarily factor that stuff into the like.
To be fair though, Polygon picked Her Story as Game of the Year.
Yeah, they've gotten better, but when they were first dabbling with that, they would have like a sidebar of like, oh, by the way, this game is really shitty when like the way it portrays women, but we're going to give it a 9 out of 10 anyways.
Compartmentalize.
Yeah, they were compartmentalized.
Yeah.
Sorry, Chris, you were like sticking your finger out, ready to rip roar.
Right. We're gonna get that in post, right? I was just gonna point out a fun fact. I don't know if this counts strictly as a Game of the Year award, but GameFAQ's annual Best Game Ever poll.
Oh god.
Undertale won that, beat Ocarina of Time in the final voter-driven match.
Like it's like best game ever.
Ever.
They do this poll like every year.
Reddit exploded.
Every
Much
year.
rage was had.
Because people hated that Undertale beat out
Other games in
Ocarina
general.
of Time in a completely subjective vote-based mass poll.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
That's like when the vote, I don't know if it was still on GameStop, but they had the vote for Game of the Year between Papers, Please and Bioshock Infinite. And there was a big Russian community that was voting for Papers, Please. And the Bioshock Infinite fans swarmed the website and tried to get the Russian fans out of the site in a very Papers, Please-like situation.
Oh god, that's so awkward. Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's the thing, is like, I guess we're undecided on whether it's a benefit to be in a completely separate category or to be up against, I always make that reference to that one Game of the Year deliberation that I can't remember what website it was or who said it or anything like that, But that same year where they said comparing Gone Home and Grand Theft Auto 5, it's not like comparing apples and oranges, it's like comparing apples and race cars. And like, I always come back to that where I'm just like, but what if you'd rather have an apple than a race car?
You need to eat.
Well,
Let's
yeah, I mean, at a certain point, if you look at the people that are doing these Game of the Year things, they have a vested interest in preserving a certain demographic, a certain, like that gamer community. At a certain point, they're starting to get more critical about stuff, you know, like to a certain degree. You're getting sites that are more willing to challenge that community, to be a little bit more okay with that stuff. But the idea that like games can be this hegemonic thing, that we have this one standard for understanding them, and that's the gold standard, and then anything else that deviates from it is somehow broken, is starting to get changed.
Does that mean, like, should websites like ours be aggressively asserting a Game of the Year list that is putting forward what games we actually think are the best Game of the Year, AAA or otherwise, or should we just, like, not partake?
I don't know, that's the question I've been circling in my head. I used to write about music, I used to do music reviews, and what I liked about compiling, I still compile an end of the year music list, but I don't do that for games as much. And I think for me, what I like about that aspect is our relationship with the things that we engage with is very fluid. And so that can change over time. So I can get access to music or whatever a week or two before it's released, but that's not going to tell me whether you're still going to be listening to this in 2 years. I can just tell you, like, give you my gut check at this point. I think this album is good or bad. And I think at the end of the year, what I liked about that is that I could kind of course correct. I could sit there and say, I really love this album in February, but I did not listen to it after I was done the review. And it kind of let me kind of end the year and also like kind of take a bit of a breather and think about that stuff. And I think what our site could do is look at it from the perspective of sort of negotiating where are we in the larger process. We're part of it. We're talking about, we're buying these games, we're writing about these games, we're circulating knowledge about these games. But we're coming at it from a very different perspective, so maybe being honest about that. So like not only should we be talking about games, but also like how do these games interact with our research? How does this reoriented the way that I understand how I approach video games or how video games function, even though it's not even part of that field? How does this maybe tweak the way that I looked at something?
Well, and on that note, I feel like it's interesting because I'd say one of the things that would bias or skew my opinion of what I think would be the Game of the Year any year the most is that I'm always going to lean towards something that either is taking something that's been done a lot and doing it the best, or like just doing something completely new. And I feel like I'm very rarely going to just go for something that's like a sequel or anything like that. I feel like we're always going to be leaning towards innovation, but it seems like Game of the Year awards often don't do that.
Yeah, they lean towards something that is like the most game, like the most Witcher. Like The Witcher 3 did open world storytelling in a way that presumably few other games have. But ultimately, I mean, you're still this burly man who's out there to have sex with witches.
Well, and like you were saying about Giant Bomb, like it comes down to it, if you just don't care, if you just don't have the feels, then what does it even matter? I mean, and not necessarily like good feels or fun feels, but like you just don't care about it that much, then like who cares how much game there is?
I think total indifference is probably one of the worst measures of how much you enjoyed a game, no matter how much time you spent playing it. You shouldn't really feel indifferent to your gaming experience when all is said and done.
Well, yeah, I think about like, you know, when I was thinking about Game of the Year last year, The Last of Us or Bioshock Infinite, I didn't necessarily have good things to say, but I definitely wasn't indifferent.
And sometimes those games that drag on for a long time do bring you to that spot where it's like, yeah, this was a good game 3 months ago. It still probably is. I mean, it hasn't changed, but I have.
I feel a bit of a contradiction when it comes to whether there is even a point to having a Game of the Year. Because on one hand, we can talk about how it's kind of an industry gala, basically. And then we can talk about whether there's a need to separate fun games and interesting games or critical games or successful games. And I can make all kinds of like mean sarcastic jokes about it, but at the same time I'm always rooting for, like, we all want our favorite games to succeed and to be noticed and to get recognized and to get other people to play them. And to some extent, Game of the Years do that, no matter how much cynicism we can apply to that. But I think picking one is still kind of reductive.
Well, and I've seen this year, I think, a leaning more so towards just individual journalists saying, here are my top 10. But I think also what you're leaning towards is that it's symbolic. But like, I guess an Oscar is also just symbolic. But there's all this authority backing to that symbol. Yeah. Whereas like a Game of the Year award is symbolic and it's empty.
The whole award mentality kind of calls back to a different kind of cultural movement, I would say, like with what you have with movies or film or however you want to refer to it. It's very different from the way that games are operating in culture now. So the fact that games have these attempts at these sorts of awards, and even us comparing it, it's like the Oscars, when we know fully well it doesn't work that way in games, it's almost looking for some sort of recognition in games that I kind of think games have outgrown.
Yeah, like a strive for legitimacy.
Exactly.
Well, and then I guess my last sort of meta question along those lines is that, I mean, if we put out a list as a publication, say, it would be sort of a crowdsourced thing from all of us. But, like, individually coming up with these lists, we're just getting to a point where, like, you cannot have played, obviously, all the games that came out that year. You cannot have played all the good games that came out that year. You can have played all the AAA games that came out that year. I mean, we can't. But say it's your job. Say you work for GameSpot or something like that. Like, how can we possibly even make these assertions? You know, like, I was looking at Time gives out a Game of the Year award. Their Game of the Year award this year was for a game called Prune. I've never even heard of that game.
That game looks really charming.
It looks cute. Now that I've looked it up, I want to play it. But, like...
That's awesome.
I was like, I've never even heard of that. Like,
I would like to give Time a shout-out during this Game of the Year type deliberation for possibly one of the best mainstream critiques of VR I've ever seen. Because they fucking took the gloves off in a way that nobody has.
I would like to know Rob's article. Game of the Year is that VR article in Time.
Yeah,
that's Rob's Game of the Year.
The Oculus Rifts.
When's Game of the Year edition of that coming out?
Okay, but back to the question. Back to the question.
But I think this is where you're getting at me talking about this all day about as grad students and as academics, but mostly as grad students where we have limited time and money. How are we going to talk about all these games when you have games like Witcher, which take, I don't know how many hours to play, or Fallout, you know, being released in November, or even the games being released in October, which is one of academics' busiest times, and there's just periods of time where gameplay does not happen as it normally does. Even if you study and write about games, there's only so many games you can play, which is why I think so many of us were happy with episodic games or small games like Her Story this year, which allowed us to be able to complete a game, think about the game critically, and the whole game, and not just bits and pieces of it, whatever we've managed to start at the Christmas holidays. So it becomes very difficult to keep up with it all.
I think that you either play a lot of short games, or I think alternatively you find one long game you really like and you lean the fuck into it, and you just play nothing but that game. I think those seem to be the two approaches that everyone in this room has.
Yep.
Like, I don't know, you're maybe more in between, Chris.
Yeah. Then there's also some shifting ground there, right? Especially when we look at AAA games, because fewer of those are coming out each year because all the big publishers are investing more and more money into single projects because it's getting harder to break even on games of those
and
scale.
Because DLC.
Yeah.
Well, and I think when it comes down to it too, is like when I sit down in front of a game, there's a bunch of things I want, but like I want to be able to consume the whole story. And, like, there's so many games coming out where that's becoming more and more difficult to do. And it's just, so you're, like, kind of going back to those, like, short episodic games being like, yeah, I just want to feel like I've seen the whole thing, like, I've experienced the whole thing.
It's probably my biggest struggle with those, because I'm one of those gamers who plays, 300 to 800 hours of a game in a year kind of a thing, and I don't do a lot of the shorter ones because I spend all my time on one or two of these really bigger ones. And I find myself really struggling with that whole completionist idea because I'm like, there's no way I could do all of this. I might 100% it in like achievements or something, but I'm not going to feel like I've actually completed it. And you do get that with those short games. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Well, and it also like creates like there's less overlap between us about what we've all played. Like, I don't know if there's a single game that we could point to that every single one of us has played.
I mean, a bunch of you were in the room streaming PT.
Yeah.
Which I went through I did some dark magic, and I have PT on my PS4, so...
I was kind of surprised that I didn't see, Game of the Year PT more often. I really wanted to see that happen. I wasn't going to be my Game of the Year or anything, but... We talked about individually everyone going around and sort of putting up one case for their sort of individual Game of the Year, but then, we spent a lot of time talking about how the title Game of the Year is kind of meaningless and whatever. And then Rob jokingly said your OTG, as in your OTP, like your one true pairing, but for games. And I feel like that is a more accurate description of what we're about to do than Game of the Year. I don't want to hear what you think the Game of the Year is. I want to hear what your OTG is.
Okay, so I've already said a lot about Her Story and Life is Strange, and those would probably be competing for my OTG. So I'm going to talk about a game that kind of helped me work through a bunch of stuff. So I study roguelikes. So I study stuff with procedurally generated levels and a lot of difficulty and weird mechanics and generally RPG trappings. And I think my OTG of 2015 would probably have been Etrian Odyssey 2 Untold, the Fafnir Knight. It's a JRPG, dungeon crawling, grid-based, party-based, first-person walking through a dungeon role-playing game where you have to draw the map on the bottom screen. Persona Q came out last year, but made by the same team. They do a similar thing. Basically what it is, it's a retelling of the second game that came out on DS, and they added a whole bunch of extra stuff. And one thing that they've added was you're like managing a town. So you're developing parts of the town, and you're also running a cafe inside of this town, in addition to going into this dungeon and stabbing these monsters to death. It's super difficult, and they have this really well-polished balance where it's almost like a puzzle. You're working your way through the dungeons, picking up better gear and stuff like that. But you're kicking up by like killing monsters and then selling the parts to a blacksmith. And what it's kind of highlighted for me is this tension between I do interactive fiction and I do procedurally generated RPGs. And this kind of functions at this weird intersection between the two. And it's made me think a lot about the way that we understand sort of novel spaces in games. The affection that people have for procedurally generated levels is kind of a weird thing because they're often very faceless, and in this case this is a very handcrafted experience. The maps are the same no matter which way you cut it, but you're drawing the maps yourself, you're exploring that space yourself, and I feel like it's just a series that I've really enjoyed, because it's portable and I have very little time, and so I can kind of do a 15-minute run and then I can kind of close my 3DS and then go on and do something else. And it's also kind of contributed a lot to the way that I've started really thinking about space and roguelikes and development. So
I'm going to be the guy that says, well, in defense of Witcher 3, I'm actually going to say Witcher 3 is my OTG.
Nice. I was kind of hoping someone would do that.
Well, because we joke about AAA, but at the end of the day, it's deserving of the praise it gets. Yes, it's creepy that there are only white people, and yes, you are playing Geralt, who is actually a very interesting character, and I think defies a lot of the stereotypes that we may transpose onto him as kind of this white dude walking around having sex with women. What I will say is that it does open world gameplay really well, but at the same time not sacrificing narrative and visuals and voice acting and art direction, does everything quite well. I was saying earlier that I thought Bloodborne had really the best art direction, and people have said Ori is also excellent, but until you run into the three ladies of Witcher, hold your judgments, because I was surprised and floored and frightened. And it was amazing to see such care and detail put into not only the soundtrack, the visuals, but again, the voice acting and the writing is excellent. The side quests are interesting, but you also don't feel like you want to put off the main story as well. There is a very strong female character that you get to play as alongside Geralt. A lot of interesting medieval narratives that you don't normally talk about, issues of abortion and just scummy conditions of medieval towns. Witcher 3 also has some of the best screenshots I've ever taken in a game, and while people are like, oh, the water effects, big deal, the sunsets are really great. I know that sounds like so dumb, but like,
I'm really compelled right now.
You're riding your horse to the forest, and the sun casts this amazing spectacle through the trees, and I've taken screenshots, and it's probably the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen in a video game. So definitely breathtaking.
I think you just made a really good sale of that.
Yeah. And procedural beard growth, which his beard doesn't get as long as you think. It does.
Disappointing.
That gets to have the procedural beard growth, or is it?
I don't keep tabs on all the male characters in the game and their facial hair, Rob.
All right. Once again, as I've been iterating throughout this talk, I don't think I could pick a single OTG. However, for the sake of talking about a game we probably will not talk about otherwise, one of my favorites, and definitely like a tie for first, at the very least for me this year, would have been Axiom Verge, which has the somewhat nefarious distinction of being, I think, the only game this year I was foolish enough to buy twice. I bought it on PS4, and then when a physical copy became available on PC through IndieBox, I bought that. From a gameplay standpoint, Axiom Verge is completely cut and dry, Super Metroid, filtered through in 8-bit graphics filter, but it does so in such a satisfying and competent way by just tightening the way the mechanics feel, the sheer number of guns and upgrades you can find, that I don't care that from a gameplay perspective, it's an unabashed clone. What really elevates the game for me, however, is the fact that from a narrative standpoint, it takes the conventions of the Metroidvania and just completely screws with them in not quite a Metal Gear Solid 2-esque kind of way, but something very close to it. It deconstructs conventions of 2D platformers from a narrative standpoint. Things like death and respawning, that cycle is messed with. Boss fights, there are a couple points in Axiom Verge where you're made to actively feel guilty about boss fights. So that was fun.
My original OTG, I was told, can't count for this year because it's still in early access, but I'm going to talk about it anyways.
I think we should count that.
So I was thinking about, and I played quite a bit of Darkest Dungeon over the course of this year. It's a side-scrolling, procedurally generated, Gothic-styled RPG. And it's one of the hardest games I have ever played. And I'm not normally the kind of person who really digs the tedious, horrible game that just utterly screws you over unexpectedly and randomly without anything you can do about it. But this one's really great, and I know I just sold it super well. But what I like about it is that its difficulty is actually reinforcing the themes of the game, which is the costs of your various forms of, I guess, power trips, more or less. You control several mercenaries, and most of them are going to die. It's up to you whether you're willing to sacrifice them or if you're going to throw away all of your money, and it's about making sure that they stay literally sane. The more you send them out into various dungeons and areas and things like that, they come back damaged mentally, physically. Their stats change, their behaviors change, their reactions to each other and other areas change depending on the things that they've seen and done. And it's up to you to try to manage them towards your ultimate goal. So it's more about pushing them and yourself psychologically to see what you can and cannot accomplish in this space. It is still early access. They are still adding things. It's a really spectacular game. It definitely asks you to look at costs, and it asks you to look at strategy in a way that I hadn't been asked to in a very long time. If I have another 30 seconds or so. My already out there OTG, I would have to say, is Undertale. A lot has been said about Undertale, but what it did for me as a gamer was it reminded me of why I started playing games in the first place. And then it really messed with me in ways that I hadn't been expecting from this cute little punny RPG. It can be a little bit heavy-handed, I would say, in its themes that it's going after and its narrative style. But what it's ultimately achieving through that, I think, is worth the 3 playthroughs you'll need to do of this game.
I'm playing it with headphones on, and I keep, giggling. Yep. And Keith and Chris are just like, what? How is this game so funny? What's funny?
It's just so cute. And then, oh.
Yeah. I was trying to think about this, about what my OTG would be, or when I was trying to think about what my game of the year would be, to be frank. And I was thinking, what have you sunk the most hours into? What have you really sunk the most time and money into? What have you really sucked the most thoughts into? And I am ashamed to say that without a doubt, the answer was Amiibos. And so I would say, by far, and I think it's a useful 2015 Game of the Year / OTG to have, because it's just something that we had seen before, but just not to such a scale. And I really do think, this is my prediction, I'm putting it on tape, is that, Amiibo was a perfect word to put out there because it's a nonsense word. When we're referring to, physical DLC, as Chris so lovingly put it, I don't think in the future we're going to call them Skylanders. I don't think we're going to call them Infinities. I think no matter what brand they are, we're going to refer to them as Amiibos. It's going to become a Kleenex word. So I think it just really fucking changed the face of the way that Nintendo is making their games. And I'm huge into Nintendo collection communities online and stuff. It's changed everything. The way that people talk about collecting, the way people collect things. And I'm still baffled about how much money, and I'm not even a completionist. I'm not the person I am a completionist, but about Amiibos I refuse to be. I'm not the person who needs every Amiibo, but still somehow I have just so many fucking Amiibos. So many Amiibos, and I rarely even use them in the games. I'll use the Animal Crossing ones at Happy Home Designer or whatever, I have the fucking cards, of course. But, I'm not even, the type of person who uses them in Smash or anything. But it's, it's a game itself. Hunting the Amiibos, finding the Amiibos, collecting the Amiibos. Because I'm that person sitting there trying to get every achievement, I am now that person in Walmart at 5 a.m. trying to get every Amiibo.
I have a Tom Nook on my desk to remind myself that I will work until I am dead.
And if you go back to our podcast where we talked about Amiibos, we said that we were pretty much done.
Yeah.
We lied.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Surprise.
Well, at that point, I wasn't going to buy any more amiibos.
At
And
that
then
point.
they made Animal Crossing amiibos.
So maybe this is why Game of the Year is useful, because, you know, when we talked about amiibos when, we thought we were done.
It was like a fad, yeah.
What about the looking forward into the future?
Darkest Dungeon in 2 weeks.
Darkest Dungeon in 2 weeks?
I would say, like, my biggest looking forward into the future thing is that I started playing the new King's Quest game. When I was, like, sitting on the PSN and I was just like, what, Sierra what? Like, I was so excited. And then I watched the trailer and I was like, no, this can't be. And then I played it and it's amazing. And I've played only the first 2 chapters. But I feel like when we're doing Game of the Year next year, King's Quest is making a big comeback. Sierra's bringing it back. I'm so glad they're just bringing these old school adventure games back. It's making my life perfect.
I remember when they first started going down this like episodic content path, and no one could nail it until Telltale kind of did. For me, looking forward, 2015 saw Porpentine start working a little bit more with Brenda Neotenemy and work a little bit more in Unity. And so Bellular Hexatosis is a really cool interactive fiction-y 3D exploration space, very short playing type game they put together. And it has like wave racer water. Like the water in those games is amazing. And the writing is of course incredible. And so that's getting me really excited to see, you know, Angel, Eczema, Orifice come out on Steam and a bunch of other really interesting stuff from Porpentine.
Maybe at this time next year we'll be exclusively talking about Oculus games.
No.
We'll just be abandon all other video games.
There is only Oculus.
I'm just kidding. I just feel like I need to bring this up. We've really yada-yadded multiple times over Her Story and Life is Strange because we've had separate podcasts and we've talked about them a lot. But yeah, go listen to our podcasts about them specifically. But I kind of feel like, based on things that have been talked about in the FPS office, if we did have to put out a Game of the Year, I feel like it would probably be one of the 2 of those.
I can't decide between the 2.
Or, I don't know, like, of games most talked about, it would be like a 3-way tie for Her Story, Life is Strange. No, a 4-way tie. Her Story, Life is Strange, Amiibos, and Inquisition.
There is a lot of Dragon Age Inquisition in our office, but it remarkably hasn't made this list.
Wasn't Inquisition 2014?
Yeah,
That
but I mean,
would be why.
But I think that's it's. But for just most talked about this year.
And
Chris and I will
Deus
hold down Xenoblade Chronicles X.
Oh yeah.
The anticipated Deus Ex Mankind, which is now pushed back to August. So I would say for anticipating, but we're looking forward to seeing how mechanical apartheid comes into a game.
Oh.
Maybe
You
we'll
groan,
be
but if you've been reading,
Yeah, we will
give
see.
it a chance. Play it first, and then judge later.
I can still
That's
judge
fair.
that marketing campaign as ill-advised.
I was just gonna say, if we're all talking about like games in the pipeline, for me, definitely No Man's Sky. It's the, it's the game I've been waiting for since I was like 10, playing Starlancer on my Dreamcast.
I hope that this time next year, I'm sitting here talking about how the new Zelda game
Yes,
is the best
please.
Zelda game ever. That's what I'm hoping for.
give
I'm
us
crossing my
something.
fingers.
No.
I was gonna troll you guys and say that my OTG was the 3DS re-release of Majora's Mask.
Still good.
I wouldn't have believed you.
Nothing stops the moon.
Game of the Year is stupid. Like, I like sitting here talking about the best games, but the award itself, like giving the award, you saying you've won 70 awards or something is bullshit. That's my aggressive conclusion.
Drop the mic.
70 awards before it was done.
Before it's done.
This doesn't play on the podcast, but I'm just saluting Emma here. That's all I've got.
Okay, then.
Thank you for listening to the First Person Podcast. We would like to thank Neil Randall and the staff of the Games Institute for their support, as well as Elise Vist, our podcast producer. We would also like to thank Stephen Trothan, who wrote and composed our theme music.